your point about the attack on elders, the institution of elderhood was one of the key things we carried in slavery, from Africa, and out of slavery. And one of the reasons why we made good decisions is that elders were there that we were listening to. Now, not only for the gangsters who are out there shooting people, but for a lot of younger people, they're listening to their peer group as the one that's giving them advice. And there's a guy that works out with me at the Y. He's blind now. He used to be gangbanging and stuff, and then he got wise. And he said, today, common sense isn't so common. And so we've now got brothers and sisters who don't want to take a shot because of what happened to us with the Tuskegee experiment. And I understand their reason. But people are not dying from taking shots. They're dying from not taking them. And of course, they were dying before you had shot.
And that's saying that people who misunderstood what happened at Tuskegee, they didn't die from taking shots. They died from not having been given shots.
Well put.
Okay. And so, and that's why it's important to study history and not just get caught up in somebody else's mystery of your history. Mm-hmm. So, but to come back to that point of apprenticeship and who are the young people listening to, it appears they're listening to their peers, but they're not really listening to their peers. They and their peers is listening to the Eurocentric socialization instruments. Mm. They control the music industry. They control the movie industry. They control higher education. They control the sports industry. They control how you get money, okay? How you get access to making money. That's what they're listening to. Mm-hmm. You see? And that level of socialization have cut the Black elder population out, because where we went to church from babies right into our adulthoods, now we almost all graduate from church when we graduate from high school and leave home. Mm-hmm. That wasn't what happened even when I was growing up. You know, when you were growing up, we stayed attached to those churches. And if, like, people from South Carolina, when we left South Carolina and went to New York, we knew what church to affiliate with as soon as we got to New York. Because that church was a part of the body church that we grew up in South Carolina. We knew what bar to hang out at, because that particular bar was made up of your community people, your village from South Carolina. And they had their signals and their signs and symbols. So, you know, don't go in the Alabama bar, you're going to get the hell whipped out of you. You better go in the South Carolina bar, don't go in the Georgia bar, okay? You had to make peace to move into those spaces. That kind of social organization that we may take for granted was very African. And it continued until very recently. The era that we're calling the hip hop generation era was when white people took real control over the socialization of Black youth outside of the school system. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the kind of money and capital that could be distributed to them, you know, for following a certain kind of philosophical or belief system, or even innovation.
And I think that that's tied to the forces that hit our community as this generation is evolving, because they tracked the hip hop generation around 1965. And there's a bridge generation that's coming directly out of civil rights, Black power. But what's happening is, with the forces that hit us that are technological, and the biggest one being in deindustrialization, where jobs are taken out of Black communities that enable Black men and women to support families. We are 20% of the industrial labor force. When those jobs go overseas or the suburbs, the family is hit harder than from anything else. And we move from families where 75% two-parent household for 100 years, from 1860 to 1968, to now two-parent households, 29%. And with whites, it's 50 from 75%. So that hit is one of the biggest. And then the one you're talking about, the technological forces that are coming from the media, from television, and all the rest of this. I was raised when television first came down. And so, yeah, it affected my homework a little bit, but it didn't affect it too much because my mother and father were in it, and you had to do all that stuff. But when families weaken, then the socialization forces that we had are weakened, and you end up with less control. Or if you look at Biggie Smalls, he's coming out of a Caribbean, African-American cultural base, mother coming from Jamaica, and she's really looking out for him. But what's he doing on the side? He's doing everything he can to get some sneakers, you know what I mean? And that's drugs. And even when he starts to hit it big, he's not sure he's gonna make it. And so he's talking about going south to deal some drugs. And, the Black hip hoppers who are, running the record business persuade him to come back. So he's got a pull between two worlds, because now there's a pull of the streets that's beginning to have a hold that's as big and sometimes bigger than the family, even when the family is doing their best to have an influence.
But here's what we missed in all of that. The same white ethnics that ran the organized crime, that put the drugs in his hands for him to sell for them, also ran the music industry that put the thought in his head to sell for them, that also control the legal industry because their children became the lawyer and the DAs and so forth. And so the system of whiteness, I don't call it white supremacy because they're not supreme to anything, but the system of whiteness in America. And then there's something else that happened. 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. 1965, the Civil Rights Bill is Act. A key component, the most key component of the Civil Rights Act was the affirmative action, meaning you cannot alter or restrict employment to someone because they're Black, okay? And now Black people have a legal recourse when someone comes and says, oh, we just got rid of that job this morning. Oh, you didn't do well on that test and the other person passed the test. I went through a lot of that. I know I aced the test. I had white guys when we would walk out of those interviews told me they failed the test, but was told to come back. I passed the test and was told they didn't have a job. But they didn't realize we would have this conversation going to the train station. And younger Black and white people, at that time I was just out of the Navy, we had a dialogue with each other. And so something happened in 1965 that we all miss. After the Civil Rights Bill was passed, passing the affirmative action program, the largest immigration bill in the history of America was passed. And you saw a displacement of the African-American population in multiple workspace, from farming right to cutting the lawns in the city, to being the contractors on the streets with helping the labor element of the contractor building the road, et cetera, or building the buildings. All of a sudden, Blacks who were brick mason couldn't get a job. And I know because my father was one of those people who was a master brick mason and couldn't even get a job building a wall. And someone who came from Eastern Europe and from south of the border was now being employed because it was a retaliation and a revenge against the African-American working class for passing that affirmative action legislation to dare challenge a system that had excluded them from unions, that excluded them from insurance, that excluded them from secure jobs. And the effect of that has been extraordinary, and we haven't heard very much about it.
That's a good point. And I think that with the Immigration Act, the biggest intrusion of new people into this country of color that they didn't expect was coming from Latin America, which had never been restricted under the immigration laws. But they began to put restrictions on Latin America through the Immigration Act of 65, but they came in, and largely from Mexico, and a lot of it illegal. And this hits especially unskilled Blacks, as well as, you point out, skilled Blacks. And I know that in areas like Texas, where you have a lot of Blacks who are into lawn businesses and stuff like that, they've been underpriced. Mm-hmm. And that has generally driven them out of it. Now, I would add a couple of things to that one. And I would say that overall, our communities came under severe attack since 1968 as payback. And I spent 2 shows previous to this, and that was the reason for them, to prepare you for understanding why did we get this heavy hit in the 60s? Because the movements that we carried out did great damage to the political economy of the system, unintended, by the way. And most of our people leading it didn't even know the consequences and the power of these movements. King didn't. Malcolm was beginning to see something. He had some perceptive insights on a few things that indicated he was beginning to see it. What did our movements do? What they did is they shifted the thought of the country on the national security state, shifted it, because what ended up happening is, we know in the end, Blacks are the first to oppose the war in Vietnam, but it's a result of the movements coming out of the South, the anti-apartheid movements and the movements we build in the North, that we began to raise the consciousness of white youth, Latinos, Asians, a number of sectors of youth and sectors of this country. They begin to be politicized, many of them in our favor, some of them against us. And so what ends up happening is this begins to lead to a democratic upsurge. And what people miss is when they talk about the movement, they say basically the movement was inspired by the promise that wasn't kept, you know, as you pointed out, hypocrisy of democracy. And that was certainly true. I joined the movement thinking all you had to do was expand the rights, we get in, and things would improve. Give us the right to vote, this, that. When I got in the movement, I saw the system was the problem, A. B, I came to realize, of course, this isn't a democracy. That was my awakening. But secondly, that our culture is at core, not only democratic, it's consensus-based. And so we got to agree as a general group that the movement that I led in San Francisco was consensus-based. The free speech movement at UC Berkeley was consensus-based because they took up our spirit in the San Francisco movement that gave birth to them, but they took it up from Mississippi, Bob Moses, people like that, teaching the major leaders of the free speech movement consensus-based democracy. The point is that democratic upsurge that comes out of African-American culture, that jazz is based on, that hip hop is based on, you understand? That spread throughout the country. And what it did was it undermined the confidence of the American people in the presidency. We ended the 2-term presidency. Their people knew this. They're very perceptive people. They did a book, which my 2 shows focused on the crisis of democracy, Trilateral Commission, to analyze this, but they were wrong in a lot of their conclusions of where they came from. And so the key point is the majority of presidents, including Kennedy, have served only 1 term in office. Well, why is that important? Because that's the icing on the cake of American power. And if you weaken that, you're weakening a lot of other things. And then we shifted people's belief in parties. And as a result, the 2-party system doesn't have a hold. And King and the movement coming out of the South, it said, we're not going to follow unjust laws. And so we started to question the judicial system. You know what I mean? Now that's real serious. And then the war machine, we were the first ones to say, hell no, we won't go. Muhammad Ali, no one called me the N-word. You know what I mean? That was the spirit of the masses of Black people, as it was in Iraq. We're the first to oppose the war in Iraq. We ain't caring about no weapons of mass destruction. We said Saddam never did anything to us. You know what I mean? What you out here sending people to kill people that never lynched us, deprived us of a job or anything else. So what we see is the hit on Black communities, where we see Black communities broken up. That was a deliberate move to see your power base. was taken away from you. Now, you couldn't break up Black communities because move us to the suburbs, they become Black. And you got about 77 core Black communities, one of which is Ferguson, from which Black Lives Matter movements launched, not just under the name of Black Lives Matter. So the point is, we need to understand that there was a basis for that power. That power continues today, though we've been hit heavy, and that basis is our culture. That's really the basis. That's what really inspired people then. That's what inspires them now.